Welcome to the Leaders in Payments podcast, where we talk to C-level leaders from across the payments landscape. We'll be discussing the products and services that impact the payment space today, as well as trends and predictions for the future of payments. We will also hear stories from our guests about their journeys to the top.
We are the commerce system. So we're not an app that sits on top of another commerce platform. And what that does is it gives us a unique ability to control the scalability of the platform, the elegance of the orchestration, going from what would be the product catalog to orders to payment orchestration and ultimately logistics and fulfillment.
That was Ryan Lee, CEO of Nautical Commerce, and he is my special guest on this episode 179 of the Leaders in Payments podcast, and I'm your host, Greg Myers. Ryan is a Wyoming native and has spent more than a decade operating at the intersection of commerce, fintech, and logistics. For those of you who may not know, Nautical is a multi-vendor platform, and as Ryan describes it, they are a start-to-finish, soup-to-nuts platform with a toolset that enables turnkey efficiency for both B2B and B2C multi-vendor marketplaces. Payments is the cornerstone capability of their platform and the foundation of any successful marketplace. Ryan and I talk about his journey to becoming the CEO, him being a self-taught coder in high school, all things payments and commerce, the proliferation of more payments orchestrators, and crypto as a solution desperately looking for a problem. Towards the end of the podcast, Lee mentions a book by Dee Hock, founder of Visa, that recently passed away. The name of the book is One to Many, and he recommends it, as do I. We've got a great episode ahead, so let's get started. Hi, Ryan. Thank you for being here and welcome to the Leaders in Payments podcast.
Well, Greg, thank you for having me. I'm honored to be able to opine about payments.
Great. So let's dive right in. If you don't mind, tell our audience a little bit about yourself, maybe where you grew up, where you went to school, where you currently live, a few things like that. We'll dive deeper into your professional background in a minute, but maybe just cover off on some of those basics for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Probably a non-traditional story. I grew up in Wyoming, went to 10 different schools in 12 years, ended up in college and probably followed a similar pattern. I ended up going to a couple different colleges. But yeah, I ended up in payments. And, I'd say my first real foray into the corporate world was with ADT Security, working in the finance group in a technology capacity, helping them really build out things like the first telecom type commerce, right? Over the telephone payments and stuff like that.
Okay. And where do you currently live today?
So currently in New York City, I spent some time in Austin, Texas, Silicon Valley. I worked for Apple, helping them launch Apple Pay. I was in Cupertino proper for 5 years. So I'm currently residing in Manhattan.
Okay. So I got to ask, Wyoming or Manhattan, which one do you prefer?
This is hard, being somewhat of a nomad and living in a variety of different cities. Every time I travel, I ask myself, can I live here? And the answer is always, yeah, I can live here. So I love every city I've lived in, partly just because the people, the culture, the food, it's all different. And so retirement, you'll probably find me traveling the world incessantly.
Nice. Well, let's now discuss the company, Nautical Commerce, or as often called Nautical. So tell us what the company does.
Yeah, so what we're doing is we are democratizing access to marketplace technology. Effectively, what that means is we believe fundamentally that most organizations are going to shift, and we believe the future of commerce is connected, where brands, retailers, and distributors, manufacturers will end up sharing catalogs across one another. And right now, with the current systems, that just isn't possible, which effectively means that all of these new systems will be multi-vendor. And so we needed to build a multi-vendor first platform. And so that's really what Nautical Commerce is. The elegance of something like a Shopify, but the scalability of something like a Hybris or a Demandware.
Okay. And I think people do you use the term platform or marketplace, or what's commonly used to describe that kind of coming together of vendors?
Absolutely. For us, we call ourselves a platform. And by definition, or at least by my definition, I think maybe everybody has a different one, but my definition of a platform is something you can actually run your business off of. We're not a bolt-on app to another commerce system. We are the start to finish, soup to nuts platform. that you can actually run a business off of.
Okay. And when someone signs up and uses your platform, what do they get?
Effectively, they get a tool set that allows them to create a multi-vendor marketplace, whether that is B2B, like something like an Alibaba or a Granger, if you kind of think of the industrial examples of B2B commerce, marketplaces specifically, or an Amazon. If you kind of think of the B2C examples, or an Etsy, right? And our goal was to get as close as possible to allowing people to do that in a turnkey way. So I would say that the dream of the team is to actually see the next Jeff Bezos or the next Jack Ma come out of launching a platform and a company off of a Nautical system.
Okay. And when did you start the company?
We started it right at the beginning of the pandemic, pre-pandemic, as a matter of fact. And a couple months in, when we realized we were kind of in lockdown, it was somewhat advantageous to us because, we just went heads down and started building the platform. As you can imagine, Greg, building a platform is hard. You're not building a small app. You're not building something that's kind of a point solution. You're building something that people are going to run their business on, which requires a lot of components. And so the pandemic was, to an extent, a bit of a blessing to us because it gave us an opportunity to just hyper focus on building the key components to make this system possible.
Okay. Are there specific verticals that would be better suited for using the product, or basically anyone who wants to build that kind of marketplace environment?
That's a great question. For us, there are probably 4 or 5 different types of marketplaces. There are product marketplaces, and we call those transactional. There's digital marketplaces. Think of these as like Apple's App Store or Roku's TV app that you buy apps and streaming services on. For us, we can support product and digital transactional marketplaces. The ones right now that we're just not focusing on are things like booking marketplaces. So if you kind of think about like an Uber or an Airbnb, these are marketplaces, but their services are booking marketplaces. Another one that we're kind of staying a bit away from right now is also think about Fiverr or a Thumbtack. These are service marketplaces that people are able to book freelance work and book someone's time. So we'll eventually get into that, but right now, high transaction product and digital marketplaces. Really, it doesn't really matter B2B or B2C. We've built the B2B components, which are much more complex than B2C. It's easier to hide the complexity of B2B and support just a B2C scenario. So B2C, B2B, product, or digital marketplaces.
Okay. And I read that you relatively recently closed a $30 million round of funding. So 2 parts to the question. One, what do you feel your investors saw in the company? And then the second part is, how do you plan to use the funds?
When you found it, it's interesting, great question. But when you found a company, you're always optimistic that the problem big enough that's really going to resonate with the rest of the world. And I think there were a couple of catalysts that kind of helped Nautical get to where we're at now, right? First, I'd spent a decade operating at the intersection of commerce, fintech, and logistics, launching Apple Pay. I worked at Moto for a while where we built a payment stack that was powering the most complex payment systems in the world. Most of them were marketplaces. And so I had this unfair advantage where I was able to meet with the business leaders of a lot of these companies. And I just kept on hearing the same refrain, right? There is no real marketplace tech. So for me, you only have to get hit in the head a couple times before, it becomes apparent that there just isn't a solution out there for something. And being kind of product native, someone who's a product manager by trade, listening to these kind of problems and listening and teasing out what the real root cause is just fundamental to the job. And so, I'd say it's serendipity that we picked marketplace at the beginning of 2020. And then, of course, the pandemic accelerated. Marketplaces became double or had double the success of a regular commerce store. And so, this put a huge emphasis on retailers and other businesses to say, wow, wait, maybe we should consider doing marketplaces. And so I think that the culmination of all of these factors and catalysts, really resonated with our investors. And Drive Capital was the lead investor. They had already done a lot of due diligence in the space, and so they were very well aware of the lack of competition and options out there for someone to really launch a marketplace platform. And so when we had initial conversations with them, it really didn't take a lot of convincing. Really, it was just what is the repeatability of the go-to-market strategy.
Okay. And then how do you plan to use the funds?
We built a big platform. And we built it on effectively a skeleton crew that was what I call kind of Silicon Valley natives. And when I say that, classically trained Silicon Valley product and engineering talent. And so to an extent, we had an unfair advantage that we were able to do it super lean. But when you're doing something big, super lean, you have to make key trade-offs. And so what this capitalization does for us is it gives us a little bit more headroom, breathing room, if you will, to do things that are going to be value added activities, revenue generating opportunities for us, right? Increase the product breadth. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of hiring to support customers, but at the end of the day, it's all about customers, right? So go to market. That's really where we're going to be spending. We're optimizing for onboarding.
Okay. Let's talk about the competitive environment a little bit. I mean, you founded this not too long ago when you really didn't see anyone else out there doing it. So maybe what does the competitive landscape look like today? And if you do have direct competitors, what do you think differentiates you from them?
Yeah, it's interesting because I would say pre-2012, everybody had to build their own marketplace platform. There just wasn't any thought leaders out there really kind of doing this for anybody. So if you kind of think of the OG marketplaces, the eBays of the world, the Craigslist, the Amazons, the Alibabas, these were ground up builds and maybe on the backs of a commerce framework. But really, if you think about marketplaces, they're a lot more than just commerce. They really do sit at the intersection of commerce, fintech, and logistics. And this is the reason why it was so hard to build. What we did is, our system looks more analogous to maybe a ERP than a commerce platform, right? We are the commerce system. So we're not an app that sits on top of another commerce platform. And what that does is it gives us a unique ability to control the scalability of the platform, the elegance of the orchestration, going from what would be the product catalog to orders to payment orchestration and ultimately logistics and fulfillment. I would argue that our biggest competitor is homegrown, internal, corporate capitalized projects that are 2 to 3 years estimated. They're $30 to $50 million spends, and most of them fail. And so in reality, what we're doing is, by us providing a turnkey marketplace platform, corporate chooses to build it themselves. It'd be like them deciding, what, we don't want to use Microsoft's operating system. We think we can do it better. Let's just build something that all of our company will use, and we're smarter than them. It's a fallacy. If you're not selling the product, why are you spending money there, right? A lot of organizations think they should build and not buy. That's our biggest competitor at this moment.
Sure. That makes sense. And we haven't talked specifically about payments, but obviously that's a component. Maybe talk about what you do in the payment space. It sounds like obviously you would accepting payments and doing payouts and things like that, but maybe explain the payment component if you don't mind.
Yeah, 100%. It's interesting because we landed on this problem that existed in the space because of payments. I've been doing payments for 25 plus years, and I just like to put a plus there. That way I don't embarrass myself. But 25 plus years, I've seen everything from lock boxes, ACHs, manual processing, wire transfers, cross-border, ended up at Visa where I learned a lot about interchange and transactions through the various providers from gateways to merchant acquirers to issuers and the like. And so the interesting part is this culminated into a career move that for me, I think was really germane to founding Nautical. And that was working at Moto as the chief product officer, right? I was there and was able to meet with 35 of Fortune 500 companies, well between that and Turbo when I was there for a while. But it was interesting because when I talked to financial leaders in these companies, because a lot of times the financial leaders were making decisions around these commerce tools because it involved payments and the complexity around payments. This is where these issues were really sussed out, right? And so it was interesting because whenever you add multiple vendors into an equation of a transaction, when there's multi-party transaction, it becomes exponentially more complicated. And anybody who's a true payments geek knows that it's not that simple. The minute you add an additional party, you got to make sure that you're compliant with OFAC, right? KYC, AML, ATF, and for the laymen that don't know that, these are all the government acronyms for things like know your customer, anti-terrorist financing, anti-money laundering, right? And so Modo was building a payment orchestration layer to help, let's call, productize and streamline the complexity of modern day enterprise payments management for a multinational corporation. And it just so happened that some of our customers ended up being marketplaces. And so I was able to really kind of talk to them about this. And so payments is a cornerstone capability of our platform. And the fintech component of that is absolutely one of the most germane parts of a marketplace. Because if you think about it, the commerce part of a marketplace is actually pretty vanilla. It's tried and true. There's 25 years of systems that have done this. There's kind of a pattern that you can follow. Where marketplaces go off the rails is all of the back office stuff, right? Vendor validation, which is KYC or KYV in that case. Know your customer, know your vendor, right? Then it's the payments orchestration, right? Is how do you recognize transactions, commission, who gets what? Especially when you have 1,000 different contracts across all these vendors, reconciling that, the accounting, how do you recognize revenue? All of these things had to be taken in consideration. And these are the fintech components of a marketplace. And then lastly is really the logistics. The logistics components are kind of a nightmare to manage. And again, this involves payments, right? Who do you push money to? Who do you not push money to with respect to shipping providers? And what's the rev share component relative to who eats that expense, right? When you're talking about shipping allocation, who accrues it and who eats it. And so it's interesting because without payments, a marketplace, of course, just falls apart because the sellers are expecting to get a payout and the buyers are expecting to get their good by pushing money to the marketplace operator. And, I think one of the key, not so clear positions that a marketplace ends up being in is they're in what we in the payments industry call the merchant of record, which creates a payment network designation on an entity where the buyer has a relationship with a marketplace operator, not necessarily the underlying sellers. And so it's incumbent on the marketplace operator, the person who is the merchant of record, to make the buyer whole if the transaction goes wrong. So it doesn't matter what happens on the seller side. At the end of the day, the marketplace holds liability, or at least the merchant of record holds that liability to make them whole. And that creates another unique dynamic where payments are absolutely germane to marketplaces. And if nothing else, are orthogonal to the entire process and flow.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So let's keep on the payments theme. Where do you think payments is headed, say, in the next 2 to 3 years?
I've always been bullish on this idea that while payments are complex, they're complex because of legislation and regulation, right? It's not so easy. I mean, many people have approached me with ideas and said, man, it'd be so easy if we just did this, right? And it's funny because even Silicon Valley's kind of gone down this path of trying to disrupt payments and kind of ran into pitfalls, right? Because they just don't think about the regulatory constraints of operating in the space. Well, so thinking about the future, I absolutely believe that you're going to see the proliferation of more payment orchestrators, right? The Spreedleys of the world, the Primer IOs. I'm very bullish on this kind of technology because I think it helps an organization manage their costs and create optionality around payment providers. There's a joke in the industry that the head of payments usually has a 3-year tenure, right? The first year of their tenure is explaining how they're going to replace the current provider. The second year of the tenure is it operating. The third year of the tenure is getting fired because they made a bad decision about choosing a payment operator. And I just think that's absurd, right? I mean, you should be able to switch out providers as easily as point and click. And I believe that these payment orchestrators allow you to do that. So you might find that there's an arbitrage opportunity to push a transaction to Stripe or Audience for a very specific use case. Why shouldn't you be able to do that with routing, right? We do that with our network traffic. We do quality of service network routing in the back end. There's modules for that. And so payment orchestrators are really kind of going to be the future. Leaning into the consumer side, and again, selfishly, I do believe firmly in contactless, right? Apple Pay, the mobile payments revolution has really kind of taken hold. I think the pandemic was an accelerator for it. When we were implementing Apple Pay it was just the perfect timing because you had the EMV mandate. And so everybody in the United States had to accept chip cards. And so we got ahead of that and went to all the major retailers and said, hey, don't forget about NFC because we might be doing something there. Hint, hint, wink, wink. I think that the pandemic made it clear to everybody that, oh, wow, this is easier than I thought. It's really hard to change consumer behavior. Getting people off the credit card of the swipe or the dip or whatever. I think the pandemic and the probability of spreading COVID really helped with that acceleration. And now people who I would have considered holdouts tell me now, oh, wow, the Apple Pay thing actually is really handy. Matter of fact, someone told me that today. It was kind of funny. But yeah, I definitely see those two things going further, right? And I know Google and Samsung have somewhat struggled in the space relative to Apple in market share, but I do think that they'll get it right. And I do think it's just going to become a ubiquitous way to pay.
Yeah, I agree with you there. What is your thought on crypto from a payments perspective? Obviously, not a great time to be talking about crypto, but it's not going to die, right? So curious if you think just overall there's a payments play or even within your business, is there a crypto play?
I like to say I'm an innovator by nature. And so anything new and cool, I'm always approaching with a very open mind. However, I think my ADT, I call ADT really my foundational education. My ADT education kind of grounded me in this. Yes, you can embrace innovation, but it's got to have a practical application. And so as much as I've loved the idea of crypto and decentralized finance and things like that, I'm still struggling personally to kind of find a use case where it really makes sense for me, right? And so what I would say is I kind of look at it as a solution looking for a problem at this point. There are some circumstances where I think blockchain technology makes absolute sense. And one of them is supply chain, right? This concept of understanding very clearly the chain of custody of, let's say, produce, something very, very hard to track, which of course will improve the overall human condition because, we stop the spread of listeria because of, lettuce, having some tainted lettuce coming from a certain region or area. I think those are applications that are absolutely germane and going to solve a real problem. But at the end of the day, tech in and of itself is powered by people and it's written by people. And at the end of the day, it has to help people. And it has to help people in a frictionless way that solves a real problem and generally generates some kind of economic activity. Right now, I think crypto in and of itself is fascinating because a lot of people are pouring money into it. The concept of Bitcoin to me, it just is mind-boggling because I can't spend it. I can't go to a Starbucks and wait for them to settle the transaction 2 hours later for me to pick up my coffee drink, right? And so this settlement issue and the reconciliation, and on top of that, I'm also somewhat cognizant of the environment. The compute resources, the absurd amount of compute resources that are going into creating blockchains and, et cetera, et cetera. And I think this is all for naught because the minute quantum computing comes out, all of this gets unraveled. So it's interesting that we're just spending so much of a carbon footprint doing this stuff. And yet we're probably 3 to 5 years out from most of the encryption technology that we've been using for the last decade is going to be obsolete because quantum computing is just going to tear through it like nothing. So, the good news is anybody who's lost their keys for their Bitcoins, they'll probably be undone then.
Nice. Yeah, that's awesome. Well, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about you. I know you've mentioned throughout the conversation a few of the places that you've worked, but maybe walk us through a timeline of graduating college up until now where you're the CEO there.
Yeah, I actually want to roll back just a little bit, Greg, and just say, I actually started working full time in high school. So when I was 16 years old, I had to take a job at Avis Rent-A-Car. One of my family members had an accident. And so I had to help kind of keep the house afloat. And so I took a full-time job during high school, stayed in high school. I'd never left, but worked from 11 o'clock at night on a Sunday evening and got off at 8 a.m. Monday, and then I went right to school until about 4 or 5, and I was going on about 3 hours sleep. And it was there that I kind of found time in the evenings, of course, when everybody was sleeping. I went out and bought myself a compact laptop. I don't know if you remember the old compact Presarios. But I bought this $3,000 brick that I could bring with me to work. And I had negotiated with my boss. I said, hey, I'm a high school student. I need like 2 or 3 hours a night to do homework. And so he was very supportive of that. And so what I did is I used that allocation of time. I probably spent like 10 grand a year buying books at Barnes and Noble to learn how to code. And so I bought every book you can imagine around coding, JavaScript, Java, whatever else existed. And over the course of a 3-year period, I taught myself how to code, and I became really adept at architecture and stuff like that, databases. And so shortly after that, I got recruited by ADT Security, still just graduated high school. And they realized I was very technically astute, and they put me on some key problems for them. And really my mandate was, automate business processes, because we were very labor intensive. And over the course of 3 to 5 years, I was able to create some pretty meaningful automations that save what I would call unnecessary labor allocations, right? And people could be repurposed for higher value activities. Eventually moved on, was recruited to Visa to help build them a site in Miami. I ran 3 departments there: innovation, business development, and kind of strategy. That's where I really got to see some of what I call kind of the sausage making of being on the P&O side, the payment network operator side, where how we did transactions and settlements and everything else, and all of the different players in the ecosystem. So once I'd spent my time at Visa, Apple called and said, hey, we heard you're the disruptive guy to come help us launch Apple Pay. And so it was still a secret project. I joined, eventually landed in private label and fraud and other kinds of fun projects to make Apple Pay super reliable and frictionless. Then I tipped my hat off to startups, right? So I jumped into Turbo, where we did, logistics. We were building a very modern transportation management system, and had all the makings of becoming a full-fledged supply chain management solution. So I spent 2.5 years there, and then moved over to Moto, where I was chief product officer at Moto, and now the CEO of Nautical. And really, I think it's just a culmination of the career, right? Nautical sits at the intersection of commerce, fintech, and logistics. Look at my background. That's pretty much what I've done my entire career.
Okay, perfect. Thanks for sharing that. What are some things you're passionate about? So maybe one work-related passion and one personal passion.
Yeah, I love the back office. Call me a sadist or whatever, but I actually love the back office because, I cut my teeth in my career at ADT working in the finance organization. And everybody that I met was, more or less in the back office. They were processing some kind of paper or some kind of process. And so I just fell in love with understanding those processes and figuring out, through people, process, and technology, how we could create automations and remove unnecessary steps or automate things. And so that has never changed. And so, a key thesis for us here at Nautical is, how do we make the back office super efficient, right? How do you scale a business at a 3-to-1 ratio instead of a 1-to-1? Because a lot of times, these organizations that are growing either in B2B or marketplaces, they have to throw a body at solving problems where their systems or their processes fall down. And so, our goal is to make the back office super, super efficient. And so I'm very passionate about that. So I love hearing customer problems because I'm like a kid in a candy store. So that I'm super passionate about. The other thing I'm passionate about is, and personally, very passionate about the ocean. And so it's no coincidence that the company is called Nautical Commerce for 2 reasons. One, not unlike the maritime merchants of the past, we are bringing in a new era of marketplaces for the world to enjoy and discover. So that's the connection there. But I actually watched a documentary, and I was already obsessed with the ocean at that point in time, but I had watched a documentary from Craig Leeson called The Plastic Ocean. And it was just eye-opening that there was more plastic in the ocean than in a lot of these landfills. And it was crazy to me. And so I think this was when I was in Cupertino working at Apple, or maybe even it was when I was in Miami working for Visa. And I was just like, wow, I'm contributing to that problem. And so I told my wife at that point in time, I said, I want to learn how to sail. And she was like, why? I go, well, because in retirement, I want to help clean up the ocean and stuff. And what better to do it than in a sailboat or commanding a project to try to find a solution to this issue. And so, yeah, super passionate about the ocean. I am a sailor. I'm certified to bareboat a 55-foot sailboat. And as a matter of fact, this evening in about an hour, I'm going to race sailboats up north of the island. So,
oh, wow. That sounds like fun.
It can be.
So one final question, and you mentioned earlier about some of the use of the investment money will be to hire new people. So let's say you hire someone, maybe they're pretty much right out of school. They come to you and say, hey, Ryan, what do you suggest I do to be successful in the payments industry or in the fintech industry? What would you tell that employee?
There's a great book written by D. Hawk that's called The Chaotic Organization. I'd point them to that first to kind of think about how the godfather of what I call fintech thinks. D. Hawk recently passed away. He's the founder of Visa. But I'd point them to that, right? Number one. Number two is actually probably before that, I'd ask them if they're crazy. Why do something in fintech, right? It's one of the most complicated spaces to operate in with the most constraints. But, if they're dead set on it, well, then I'd point them to Dee's book. But otherwise, I would really challenge them to think about what does the ideal flow look like from a buyer to making the merchant right. Because in every fintech transaction, you have the buyer and you have the seller. And it's always interesting to get a new perspective, the younger generation coming in and looking at things anew. Because I like to say us gray hairs, we're somewhat tainted because, we've always done what we've always done because of the constraints that exist now. And this is the reason why innovation, is for the young at heart, is because at the end of the day, they do have a new perspective on things. And we tend to be, or can be, stuck in our ways, partly because of those constraints, and they're unconstrained. And so I would just ask them, what would an ideal situation look like? And then really kind of pressure test that. And, again, I think people should do what they're passionate about. If you are truly passionate about fintech, if you're truly passionate about whatever, do what you love. Once you do that, I know it's cliche, but you won't work a day in your life. Lindy jokes and says I'm a workaholic, but I like to say I just play a lot.
Nice. No, I think that's great advice. Even, for anyone joining any industry is to follow your passion for sure. So Ryan, we've covered a lot of ground so far about the company, your background, kind of where you think payments is headed in the future. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up?
It's interesting. One thing that I do, and I want to kind of key into what you'd ask about the advice I give to folks that join a company anew. I think one of the secrets to my success, to the extent that that's happened, is I was always about creating capacity for myself. And so I always encourage people to spend 20% of their time to figure out how to automate themselves out of a job. And I know that sounds a little crazy, but when you spend 20% of your time really kind of thinking strategically about, how do I eliminate this part of my work, or how do I go faster, it helps you exponentially scale from position to position. And so that's the advice I'd leave for the next generation, if you will, or new incumbents coming in is, figure out ways to build capacity, because that's how you stay competitive.
Yep. I love that. Well, Ryan, thanks so much for being on the show today. It's been great to learn about you and the company, but I know your time is very valuable, so I want to be sensitive to that. But thank you so much for being here today.
Absolutely. Thank you. Have a good one, Greg.
All right, you too. And to all you listeners out there, I thank you for your time as well. And until the next story.
Thank you for joining us this week on the Leaders in Payments podcast. Make sure you visit our website at leadersinpayments.com, where you can subscribe to the show and where you'll find our show notes. If you enjoyed listening, please share on your social channels as well.